Chapter 22. It all comes to a head. Sirius lay in bed the next morning wondering if it had all been a dream. He remembered being able to take a bath, eat a good meal, and he seemed to have had a good night's sleep. Yes, it's all been a dream. A wizard named Merlin has not rescued me, he thought, as he whimpered and pulled the soft blankets up to his chin. I'm still in my cell. The dementors will come at any. Was that a bird singing? We don't have birds at. There is softness under me. Wait. Soft blankets? Suddenly Sirius's eyes popped open and he sat up in the bed with his eyes widening in awe. It wasn't a dream, he thought, as a large grin appeared on his face. I'm really in a house. Sirius slowly stood up and looked around the room, and the colors that met his eyes almost made him cry. All of the blues, greens, yellows, and browns, along with all the other colors, was a welcomed sight, and it was quite the contrast to the dark dank gray color that his Azkaban cell had been. He walked to the window and stared out in wonder. He saw the green grass-covered fields and hills that seemed to stretch on for miles, and there were a few trees sprinkled in his line of vision. The little bluebird that had made him realize that this was in fact real, was sitting on the edge of a flower pot pecking at the dirt that was in it. It was the most beautiful sight that Sirius had seen in almost 11 years, and he sank into a chair that was beside the window and watched the bird until it flew away. He stood up and wandered around the room he was staying in, and took it all in. It was a small, plain room, but it was comfortable. A mirror that hung above a dresser caught his eye and he went to it. He stared at himself for a bit, and couldn't believe it was actually him that he was looking at. He was thin and gangly looking, but after the years in Azkaban it was to be expected. His hair and beard were clean and trimmed now. He had done that after his bath the night before, but what really made him do a double take were his eyes. He stared at them in the mirror, and it looked like they were haunted and dead, until he remembered the little blue bird. Then there it was, a small spark of life had appeared in his eyes. I am free, Sirius thought, as he gave himself a small smile and nodded, before he headed for his bedroom door. He had been too shocked the night before to really pay attention to anything, but he now realized that the cottage was small. It had 2 bedrooms, but each had their own bath. There was a sitting room, and a very large library that looked slightly out of place for the small cottage, but he suspected that it had been magically enlarged. There was also a reading room, and this was the room he recognized from the night before. He came upon a decent-sized kitchen and found 2 elves humming and singing happily while they worked. He just stood in the doorway, smiled, and his eyes closed for a few minutes, taking in the sounds and smells of everything the elves were doing and cooking. He opened them again when all the sounds stopped, and found that the 2 elves were now standing in front of him. We didn't want to disturb you, Mr. Sirius. You seem to be lost in thought, one of them said as he smiled up at Sirius. I was just listening to you go about your work. It's been a while since I've heard singing, he said, and realized that his throat was dry because his voice was raspy. The elf he had been talking to picked up on that, and fetched him a glass of water. Thank you, Sirius said after he had drank it, and then he handed the empty glass back to the elf. Master says that if you need anything, just ask. We can get it for you. I'm Whimsy, and this is Choppy. Sirius chuckled. Choppy? I'm the cook, Choppy said with a large smile. Master said it was a funny nickname, but my real name is Minnie. You can call me either name you want though. You 2 don't talk like normal elves, Sirius said curiously as he looked at them. Oh, we have been with Master a long, long time. We learned to speak properly because Master taught us how to. He is a good master to us, Whimsy said. Where is your master? Sirius asked. He is outside in the garden. Would you like me to take you to him? Choppy asked, and Sirius nodded. They walked out the back door of the cottage and headed towards a large herb garden. There Sirius saw him again, the man who saved him from Azkaban. He was pulling weeds from the garden, but he was dressed in simple red robes with gold trim, and Sirius smiled because it reminded him of Gryffindor. From the back though, he could be mistaken for Albus, but when Merlin turned around Sirius realized that he looked nothing like him. His face was different and he looked young, maybe 50 or so, and Merlin's brown eyes held no ulterior motive like Albus's did. All they held was kindness. "Good afternoon, Sirius," Merlin said with a gentle smile. "Forgive me, I like getting my hands dirty every once in a while," he continued, as he pulled his wand out and washed off his hands using the water charm. "Master, dinner will be ready in 2 hours, but can I get you some tea and biscuits to hold you over?" Choppy asked. "Yes, Choppy, I think that would be lovely. Thank you," Merlin said, and he smiled as the elf paraded away. "Dinner? Did I really sleep all day?" Sirius asked in astonishment. Merlin chuckled. "Can you deny that you needed it?" he asked, as they walked towards a patio that held a table and a few chairs. "No, I suppose I can't," Sirius said with a smile as he sat down. They sat in silence for a few minutes as they sipped their tea, but suddenly Sirius shifted uncomfortably and looked at Merlin. "Why did you do it, and are you really Merlin?" "Forgive me if we talked about it last night, I was somewhat in shock," Sirius said apologetically. Merlin smiled at him. "It is understandable, but no, we did not talk about it. To answer your easier question, yes, I am Merlin. I'm not just a wizard who fancies the name, so yes, I'm the real one. Some people would call what I have achieved immortality, but I prefer to call it longevity. After all, where would I be if the earth exploded? No can really live forever," Merlin said with a chuckle. Sirius chuckled also, but he still looked unconvinced. "I'm sorry, but I just can't believe you are really Merlin. I'm sorry." "It is all right, Sirius. I know it will take time for you to believe that. Now, let's move on to why I rescued you from Azkaban. I know some people will not agree with me, but I do not believe in withholding important information from someone, and if we are going to heal your mind, you need to know the truth. Tell me, what do you think about being free? Do you think you deserve it?" Sirius shook his head sadly. "I like being free, but I don't think I deserve it. I killed my best friend and his wife, and I let my godson down." Merlin studied him for a moment. "Sirius, how do you think you killed Lily and James?" Sirius sighed heavily, and buried his head in his hands. "I convinced them that the rat, our other friend Peter, would be a better secret keeper than me since I was the obvious choice. Peter betrayed us all, and it wasn't until that night that I realized what a mistake it was. I killed them." "So you went to their house, drew your wand, and killed them?" Merlin asked. "No, but—" "Then you didn't kill them," Merlin said gently. "You made a mistake, Sirius. Anyone could have done that. I probably would have made the same choice. It was logical, and it, at the time, seemed like a brilliant plan, but you didn't kill them. Peter betrayed you all, and he is the one responsible." "I still feel like it's my fault," Sirius mumbled. "All right, we will come back to that. Now tell me, how did you let your godson down?" "I wasn't there for Harry. I gave him to Hagrid, who told me Dumbledore wanted to check him over, and I went after Peter. When I confronted him, he blew up the street and killed those moles. I don't know whether he died in the explosion, or if he escaped. All I know is that I was chucked into Azkaban without a trial and left there to rot. If I hadn't gone after Peter, I could have been there for Harry. By the way, do you know him? How is he? Is he at Hogwarts yet?" Sirius asked, looking hopefully at him for any news about Harry. "I have never met Harry personally, but I do know of him," Merlin answered, pulling out a photograph. It was the picture of Salazar standing beside a snake statue in the Slytherin common room. He was holding up Nora and smiling, though he looked a bit tired and annoyed. Sirius stared at the picture in shock, and took it from Merlin with a shaky hand. "He's in Slytherin?" Sirius asked in astonishment. And is he holding a snake? Merlin chuckled lightly. Yes. But tell me, Sirius, do you know the people in this picture? Merlin asked, holding up another picture. This picture was of a couple with 2 children. The woman had red hair and green eyes, and the man had unruly black hair that was untamable, and he was wearing glasses. The 2 children looked exactly alike, except one was much smaller than the other. They were wearing mule clothes, and looked like they had been hiking because they were standing on a hill looking out over the ocean. It also looked like they hadn't known that their picture had been taken. Sirius stared at the picture in shock, but then his face grew dark and he glared at Merlin. Is this some kind of a joke? He asked, with his voice growing dangerously cold with anger. No, Sirius, it's not. Merlin said calmly, taking both pictures and laying them on the table side by side. Do you see this picture here? He asked, pointing to the picture of Salazar. This is not Harry Potter. This is one of my dearest friends, and his name is Salazar Slytherin. Sirius's eyes grew wide with shock, but Merlin continued before he could ask a question. In this picture, Salazar is standing here, he said, pointing towards the smaller boy in the family photo, and yes, Lily, James, and Harry know exactly who he really is. You see, Sirius, the day before Voldemort showed up in Godric's Hollow, Salazar went there and told the Potters that Peter had betrayed them and he sent them to another country so that they would be safe. There was no time to tell anyone about the plan because Salazar had only one day to come up with it in the first place. But he also told the Potters not to say anything to their friends. He said with a sigh, I didn't even know about it until last year when another friend of mine told me that Salazar had made contact. But what happened? Why does he look like Harry? Sirius asked. Merlin went on to tell him the whole story, and even showed Sirius a few more photographs of this past summer, including some from the real Harry's birthday, though they were taken from far away. He even told Sirius about the adventures of last year, and all that Salazar had endured because of Albus and Voldemort. He would not tell Sirius where the Potters were though, only that Salazar had sent them to a different country. He also told Sirius that no one knew about his situation with the Dursleys until last year, and explained about Peter being at Hogwarts. By the time Merlin was finished, they had already been served dinner, and Sirius was in another state of shock, but managed to eat his meal. Whimsy was just taking the plates away when Sirius finally looked at Merlin and nodded. I still don't think you are the real Merlin, but I can't deny that Lily and James are alive. Sirius said softly, looking at a picture of James, Lily, Harry, and Salazar, as the real Harry blew out his birthday candles. What do we do now? He asked. First, we need to heal your mind, and I'll be working with you on that. Being in Azkaban is not good for anyone, especially an innocent man. Secondly, we need to keep you safe and hidden until we figure out what to do. I admit, getting you out of Azkaban was spur of the moment. However, I don't want you to think that I broke you out of one prison just to put you in another. You'll need fresh air and room to move around in. That is why living with me is ideal because you'll have plenty of space here, but the wards will bounce you back if you get too close to the edge. I do this for your safety as well as my own. The only people who can get here are only those who know I'm still alive. When you are ready, and the rest of us figure out what to do, we will work on getting you that trial. You are free to roam around and do what you wish, but you cannot leave the property. I understand, Sirius said, taking a deep breath. James, Lily, and Harry are alive though, and I know I'll see them again one day when all of this is over, so I can do this. I understand I cannot have contact with them because it would put them in danger, but I can live with that. I think just knowing that they are alive and safe will be a big help. As for trading one prison for another, I do not think that. This is a lot better than Azkaban. I have fresh air, sunshine, and life all around me. Then we are off to a good start, my friend, Merlin said with a sincere smile. Sirius nodded and chuckled. Does the Ministry know I'm gone yet? He asked. Merlin laughed loudly. Yes, and so does Salazar by now, but I have already owled him the details. Owl? Sirius asked. What about your phoenix? Oh, Nahum is not mine unfortunately. Bonding with a phoenix seems to be the one thing I have never been able to do, but I did borrow him from a friend. This however, was this morning's daily profit. Merlin chuckled, as placed the paper in front of Sirius. Sirius Black escapes Azkaban. That was the headline that greeted Salazar that morning at breakfast, and all he could do was stare at it open-mouthed, with his fork paused halfway to his mouth. The great hall was abuzz with the news, and up at the head table several people were concerned. Minerva and Severus were concerned because one look at Salazar's face told them he had no idea what was going on. Albus was in a near panic because not only did he not have a defense professor, but he had to deal with this too. He had already had strong words with Minerva and Severus over the Lockhart situation, and he had told them he couldn't teach defense because he had other responsibilities, but they seemed unconcerned and unapologetic. They reminded Albus that he had wanted to expose Lockhart, and they did. Albus had argued that he didn't want that to happen until the end of the year, but they still didn't care because what is done is done. This morning though, Albus had sat in his place at the head table staring at the Daily Prophet in shock. He could already hear Fudge screaming for advice, and Albus really didn't want to have to hear it. He obviously didn't know why Sirius escaped, but all Albus could think of was that Sirius had escaped to finish what his master started 11 years ago, and that meant he was coming after Harry. He also needed to find a new defense professor, but now because of Sirius's escape, he had an idea on who that could be. Salazar had spent all day in a haze. Everyone knew what Sirius had been accused of, and all day he could hear whispers that Sirius had escaped to find him and kill him. He knew this was not true of course, but Salazar's problem was that he didn't know where Sirius was, or how and why he had escaped. He had already told Fred and George to keep an even closer eye on Scabbers to make sure he didn't run, and the boys said they would, and he had even argued with Severus just so he could get detention, so that he would have a chance to sit and talk with him. Needless to say, it had been an all-around bad day for everyone. Thankfully the problem was solved at dinner that night when a beautiful eagle owl swooped into the great hall carrying a letter. At first he thought it was Malfoy's owl, so Salazar didn't pay it much attention, but he was startled when it landed in front of him. He took the letter and quickly began to read it. I know we haven't spoken in 11 years, but I also realized that it isn't entirely your fault, seeing as you were stuck with the Dursleys and you were very busy this past year. Nicholas told me everything about it. I just want you to know that I have him, and will be telling him everything. His mind needs to heal after being in there for so long, so I think it is the best way to get him on the right path. Don't worry my friend, I'll take care of him. Please make sure you tell whomever you need to that things are all right, and come see when you can. You know where I am. M. Salazar breathed a huge sigh of relief, and took out a spare bit of parchment and quill to scribble a quick reply. I am relieved to know this. Thank you my friend, and I am so sorry that I have not been by to see you. I will come as soon as I get a chance. I have been worried all day about this situation, but I am relieved to know he is with you. Please tell him we know where the rat is, and that we are watching him by using a certain map. I will also let them know as soon as I can, and also please tell him that I may have a way for him to communicate with them through mirrors. He should know what I mean by the map and the mirrors. Take care and I'll see you soon. S. He quickly tied the note to the owl's leg and it flew off, then he laid his head down on the table and breathed another sigh of relief. Is everything okay, Harry? Gordy asked, as he looked at Salazar. Yes, a great worry has just been lifted off my shoulders, he answered, as he looked at his plate full of food. He suddenly realized that his appetite had returned, and he dived into his dinner with gusto. Gordy chuckled as he watched him. Well, I'm glad you have received good news, he said, as he looked at Salazar knowingly. Salazar's smile faltered a bit as he looked at Gordy, but the young lad just chuckled and finished his dinner. Then he stood up and headed for the doors. "What was that about?" Blaze asked, as Gordy left the Great Hall. "I have no idea," Salazar said, as he studied Gordy's retreating form. "Well, what are you going to do about Sirius Black? Everyone is saying he broke out to kill you." Salazar laughed. "I'm not worried about Black. He can't get to me at Hogwarts. It will be all right, you'll see." "If you say so, Harry. Personally though, I would be scared if he were after me," Blaze said with a shiver. "Well, as I said, it will be all right. Now, I better get going. I still have detention with Snape." Blaze laughed. "Okay, I hope to see you later and in one piece," he said, as Salazar grinned at him, and headed for the dungeons. When he got there, he was surprised to see Minerva and Poppy, but he sighed and plopped down in a chair. "As you all know, I have been out of sorts today, but the letter I received at dinner has helped tremendously. A dear friend of mine contacted me to say that he has Sirius," he said with a happy grin. "You know how he was rescued?" Poppy asked in shock. "I suspect Sirius will need to see a mind healer." "I don't know how he rescued him, but Poppy, I assure you the man Sirius is with is able to help him much more than we could." "What is his name?" Minerva asked. Salazar sighed and shook his head. "I'm so sorry, but I cannot tell you that. I am under an unbreakable vow never to reveal his continued existence to anyone who doesn't already know. The good news is that Sirius is safe, well taken care of, and we don't have to worry about him." "Lily and James will be happy to know this," Severus said with a nod. "Yes, they will," Salazar said, and pulled the mirror out of his pocket. For the rest of the detention, Salazar filled the Potters in on everything that had happened. James said that he would send a mirror for Salazar to give to Sirius, and Salazar assured him that it would get to him. Lily burst into tears, and told Salazar to tell Sirius that they are so sorry that there was nothing they could do for the last year, and Salazar said he would. By the time his detention was over, Salazar felt like another weight had been lifted off his shoulders, but there was still something nagging him. How did Merlin know that he had been thinking about an Azkaban breakout? Salazar had been telling Nicholas everything, but he hadn't been able to tell Nicholas about that yet, so how did he find out? Salazar sighed as he lay in bed that night. It seemed like when one problem was solved, two more took its place, and he didn't like it. It was late in the afternoon the day before Halloween, and it had been a few days since the news of Sirius's escape. Albus was sitting in his office with his head resting in his hands. He had just got back from a meeting with Fudge, whom he had told his suspicions on why Black had escaped, but he had not thought that Fudge would send the dementors to Hogwarts. He had told the minister that the school was well protected, but Fudge had insisted, and now Albus was going to be stuck with over 100 dementors patrolling the grounds. He was not having a good week. The castle's warnings were getting stronger by the day, and he was still no closer to figuring out what was going on. He had cornered Harry at every opportunity to see if he was up to something, but so far the boy hadn't done a thing. Albus knew that a very dark object was inside the castle and he knew it was active, but what it actually was, he didn't know. Albus knew Harry had to be responsible though. The boy was too much like Tom and that unsettled him. Traveling was what Tom had been doing before he descended deep into the dark arts. Could that be what Harry is doing as well? Albus thought as he sat behind his desk. Is he looking into the dark arts? The boy knows too much about them as it is, and I can't have him gaining any more knowledge about them. Albus sighed again, but a smile appeared on his face as a knock sounded at his door. His, hopefully, new defense professor had just arrived. Albus knew that if he played this meeting right, that it would go his way. "Come in," he called out, and smiled his best grandfatherly smile as a man in shabby robes entered his office. "Remus Lupin. So good to see you again," he said happily. "Hello Albus. Remus said with a small smile. I was surprised to get your owl. What is it that you wanted to speak to me about? Well, Albus said with a sigh. As you know, Sirius has escaped and I'm in need of a new defense professor. I was hoping that since you are well skilled in defense that you would be willing to take the job. He said, deciding to get right to the point. Remus looked slightly taken aback, and his smile faltered a bit. What does taking the job have to do with Sirius? He asked, as he sat down in one of Dumbledore's armchairs. I have come to believe that Sirius broke out of Azkaban to come after Harry. He said gravely, and Remus's face took on a look of shock and fear. You are well skilled in defense against the dark arts, and you know Sirius. I think if you take this job, that you can help to protect him. Does Harry know that Sirius broke out to come after him? Remus asked with alarm. Albus shook his head. No, I have instructed the other professors to not say a word to him. He is just a boy and needs to concentrate on his studies. He does not need to be weighed down by this burden. Remus nodded in understanding. How is Harry? What is he like? He asked, hoping that the headmaster will tell him something, anything, about him. Albus sighed heavily. He knew it was now or never, and he needed Remus to accept the defense position. Truth is, Remus, I'm worried about him. He is in Slytherin, not Gryffindor like we had all hoped, and I'm afraid that some of the darker families may be influencing him. He knows things about the dark arts that he should not. He also has beliefs and ideals that I feel are not proper, and he has used blood magic. What? Remus shouted in surprise as he leapt out of his seat. Blood magic? That can't be. I'm afraid it is. Albus said in a solemn tone as he shook his head. He's a very bright and powerful boy, but he is also a Parselmouth, just like Voldemort was. I do not think he is dark though. Albus said quickly, as Remus's eyes widened in horror. He just needs to be influenced in the right ways. He's not evil, is he? Remus asked, slowly sinking back down in his chair. No, he's not evil. Albus answered with a smile. The situation is promising. Most of his friends are in Gryffindor and one is even a female mole-born, but I fear that is not enough. I will be honest, Remus, I am hoping that you take this job so that you can be a positive influence on him. I hate to say this, but you are a link to his parents and I'm hoping that Harry will look up to you because of that. He said gently. What about my condition? Remus asked in a soft voice. Severus Snape is our potions master, and I know he will brew the wolfsbane potion for you. The rest of the staff will be alerted to your condition, but many already know about it, seeing as they are your own former professors. Your condition is really a moot point, Remus, but your knowledge about Sirius and defense against the dark arts is vital. If for some reason Sirius comes here, Harry will need you. Albus said in his best grandfatherly voice. Remus nodded slowly, but then a hard look came into his eyes. Severus Snape is a Death Eater, Albus. Why is he here? I place my full trust in Severus. He came to me before the war ended. Remus, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room, but it was Severus that told me that Voldemort had targeted Lily, James, and Harry. I trust him. We need you here at Hogwarts, Remus. Harry needs you because you are the best person to help protect him in this situation. Remus's eyes widened in shock at Albus's mini speech, but then he nodded slowly. I understand. I'll do this for Harry. He said softly. When do you need me to start? As soon as possible. Albus said with a wide smile. Today is Friday, so you can take the weekend to move your things in, and Monday will be your first day of lessons. All right. As long as you are sure that none of the students will find out about my condition. They won't. Albus assured him, as they both stood up. I'll see you to the entrance hall. I have to go speak with Severus, and he will be in the dungeons. Remus nodded, and they chatted about different things as they made their way down the grand staircase. When they reached the second floor, they heard loud laughter and shouting coming from an empty classroom. They found Harry, Blaise, Neville, Hermione, Gordy, Colin, and the twins sitting around the classroom, and each one of them was either yelling or laughing about something. Nora was slithering back and forth across a desk talking to Neville. Harry's skin had been changed to red while his hair had been changed to gold. Harry and Gordy were also shouting at each other about something. "And yet you are a Slytherin who is advocating for Gryffindor colors. This is treachery," Salazar shouted at Gordy, as the lad started laughing loudly. Hermione started giggling. "It's not treachery, Harry, you and Nora match." "But I am a Slytherin," he wailed. "I can't walk around looking like this. Speaker, I like my new red and gold colored fleece warmer. It's getting colder, so now I will stay warm. The red looks good against my shiny black scales," she said with a firm nod of her head. "Fred, George, so help me, I will hex you into oblivion if you don't change my skin and hair back," Salazar said, completely ignoring Nora. The twins just shook their heads and laughed even harder. They had used another prank from the Marauder book, and this spell would not wear off for a week without the counter curse, which of course, only Fred and George knew. "But red looks good on you and Nora, and you both have gold trim." Neville grinned, as he pointed to Salazar's hair. Colin laughed and took a picture of Harry, who immediately hit the lad with a stinging jinx for doing it. He just grinned at Salazar. "You'll have to protest this better than that, Harry. Gordy said that you secretly like red and gold, so we know you aren't totally against it." Salazar glared at Gordy, whose eyes were shining brightly with mischief. "Well, his information is incorrect," he said firmly. "I personally think the Sorting Hat made a mistake. Clearly Gordy belongs in Gryffindor, not Slytherin." "That's not true," Gordy laughed. "If you people don't listen to me, I will bite you," Nora suddenly shouted. Everyone quieted down and turned to look at her, though some were still snickering. She was now on the floor, and was slithering back and forth in front of them. "Now that I have your attention," she said, as she glared at Salazar, "this is how it will be. I like my red and gold fleece warmer, so it will stay that way. Speaker, I had green and silver all winter last year, so I don't see the harm in it." "Nora, we are not talking about your warmer. We are talking about my skin and hair," Salazar answered calmly. "If you want your fleece warmer sock to be red and gold, that is fine, but I cannot walk around looking like this for a full week." Blaise nodded. "I agree. I vote that Nora's warmer stays red and gold if she likes it, but Fred and George must turn Harry's hair and skin back to normal, or at least to a silver and green combination." "Thank you, Blaise," Salazar shouted happily. Remus looked at Albus in shock. He didn't know what was being said in Parseltongue, but he recognized the state in which Harry was in. After all, he helped James and Sirius create the spells. "Albus, what is going on?" he asked in a hushed tone. "Well, it seems that Nora, the snake, happens to like her new red and gold fleece warmer, but Harry doesn't like his hair and skin color," he whispered. "Can those children speak Parseltongue?" Albus shook his head. No. They only understand it like I can because Harry taught them last year." "Well, except for the 2 first years," he answered as the children started laughing again, or in Salazar's case, shouting. "I vote we leave both the way they are." Gordy grinned, and all the Gryffindors laughed. "I agree," they all shouted. "But I'll be stuck like this for a week," he protested. "And we will be laughing for a week," Neville grinned, as the others snickered. "All of you, except Blaise, are bloody Gryffindors," Salazar ranted, which made all the Gryffindors start laughing again. "Not all of us are Gryffindors though," Gordy said with a grin. "You seem to be an honorary member of Gryffindor," Salazar grumbled, which only made Gordy laugh even harder. Then Salazar sighed and shook his head. "Well, I'm not going to talk to any of you for a full week then," he grumbled. Gordy laughed. "Spoken like a true 12-year-old," he said, eyeing Salazar with a grin. Salazar cast a sideways glance at him and narrowed his eyes, but chose to ignore him. Then he sighed loudly, threw his hands up in the air, and turned to stomp out the room. That's when he noticed Albus standing in the doorway with someone else standing right behind him. "Headmaster," he said in shock, and everyone jumped up to look towards the door. "Hello, Harry," Albus said as his eyes twinkled in amusement. "I see there is a difference in opinion for the choice of colors." "Yes, there is, and I think Fred and George need a month's worth of detention," he said, as Fred and George laughed loudly. "I agree," Blaze cried. "Especially since Harry's red skin and green eyes makes him look like he's been decorated for Christmas." He laughed, which caused them all to snort. "I'm afraid I cannot do that," Albus chuckled. "But I can introduce you all to your new defense professor. This is Professor Remus Lupin." Salazar's eyes widened slightly and he heard Fred and George gasp, but they were able to quickly cover their shock. "It's nice to meet you, Professor," Salazar said politely, holding out his hand. "If I may, what house were you in, and would you be able to help me?" Remus chuckled and shook Harry's outstretched hand. "I was in Gryffindor, so I actually like the colors." "Gah!" Salazar shouted, and threw up his hands in frustration as all the others started laughing again. "Well, there goes any hope of me getting put back to normal. Hogwarts has way too many Gryffindors in positions of authority," he grumbled. "Is little Harrikins going to be in a bad mood all week?" Fred laughed. "Yes, he is," Gordy said with a grin, which caused Salazar to glare at him again. "But I think we should all watch our backs. I sense a prank war coming on." "I don't have to watch my back. I'm perfectly safe from Harry's revenge," Blaze announced. "Yes, you are," Salazar said with a firm nod, as the others laughed. "The rest of you, however, not so much. Gordy especially because he is in Slytherin. My revenge on him will be slow and painful." "I doubt that." Gordy laughed. Then he turned towards Albus and Remus. "Forgive us for ignoring your presence, professors." "It's all right, Mr. Offen. I'm just glad to see that you are all having a splendid afternoon." Albus chuckled, as Salazar scoffed loudly, which caused the children to start laughing again. "We are doing just fine, Dumley. Although Speaker has thrown some sort of a fit, and I don't understand why. My warmer is very pretty. Bushy made it herself," Nora said, as she wrapped herself around Neville's wrist. "You are being deliberately thick about this, aren't you?" Salazar asked, turning towards her. "Of course I am. I know we mean your skin and hair, but Bottom said it would be fun to see you all riled up, and he was right," Nora said with soft hiss. "Traitor," Salazar mumbled. "I'm so glad you like your warmer, Nora, but she is not a traitor, Harry." Hermione giggled. "Debatable," Salazar said, which caused them all to grin. Albus chuckled, and even though Remus cringed every time Harry spoke in Parseltongue, he smiled at him. Albus told them all that it was nearly time for dinner, and to head to the Great Hall because he had an announcement to make. Remus excused himself so he could head home and pack, but Albus headed for the dungeons to talk with Severus first. When they got to the Great Hall, the children split up and went to their respective tables, but Nora decided to spend dinner with Hermione and Neville, seeing as the twins never sat with the younger children during meals. Since it was Hermione who gave Nora the new fleece warmer, Nora kept praising and thanking her for it. Salazar knew that Nora just wanted to show it off to all the Gryffindors though, and he couldn't help but laugh. As for the joke the twins played on him, he wasn't angry about it. In fact, he was a bit relieved that they chose him. He knew they wanted to try out the spells in the Marauder book, and it was better that they single him out, rather than some random student. Besides, It proved to be a good distraction from the ever-increasing doom that the castle kept placing on him. He began wishing Godric had been able to make the ward better though, so it would be able to actually lead them to the dark object. Salazar had no knowledge of how the ward worked because it had always been one of Godric's secret family spells, so he couldn't rework it even if he tried. Albus's dinner announcement turned out to be about the dementors, and at that news, Salazar sighed and shook his head. He knew from Albus's tone that the headmaster didn't want them here any more than anyone else did. The students looked frightened, the other professors looked angry, and Salazar couldn't blame them. How could the ministry send those nasty things here? These children were defenseless against them, and he didn't even know if they would be able to learn the Patronus charm at such a young age. When dinner was over, Salazar left the table with a heavy heart and mind. The day's good-natured pranks and laughter were long gone now. Blaise seemed to be lost in thought with a horrified look on his face, and Salazar wished that there was something he could do for him. Gordy kept shooting him glances, but then young lad laid a hand on Salazar's shoulder. "Are you all right, my friend?" he asked softly, looking at Salazar with concern. Salazar shook his head. "No Gordy, I'm not," he said. How can the ministry send dementors here? I've read that they are nasty things, and it will be all right. We just need to stay out of their way, and we need to find a way to protect the children from the dementors on a large scale." "Protect the children?" Salazar asked suddenly, looking at Gordy with a calculating gaze. Gordy's eyes widened. I mean the other children like us. There has to be some kind of spell, right?" Salazar stared at Gordy for a moment, but then he did something he swore he would never do to a child. He cast a wandless legilimency spell. He was met by a strong, massive block that was way beyond the capabilities of a child. Gordy gently pushed him out of his mind though, and looked at Salazar with tears forming in his eyes, but Salazar's wand was instantly in his hand, and he pointed it at Gordy's head. "Who are you?" he growled, as he roughly shoved Gordy into the wall. The other students that were around paid them no attention, and Blaise had been swept up into the crowd that was making their way into the entrance hall. Gordy just shook his head, looked around, and then looked back at Salazar, whose face was cold with anger. "Not here, Salazar," Gordy whispered as the tears spilled down his cheeks. "Please, not here. It's too complicated to explain." Salazar's eyes widened in alarm at the mention of his name, and he was about to say something when suddenly they heard lots of screaming coming from the second floor. Both Salazar and Gordy looked in that direction, then back at each other, before they began pushing their way through the crowd of students. They finally managed to push their way through and they arrived on the second floor. The students that were milling about looked terrified, and it didn't take Salazar long to figure out why. There, right beside the out-of-order girls' restroom were words written in blood on the wall. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air beware." Salazar just stared at the wall with his mouth opening and closing like a fish because that wasn't the only thing in the corridor. A first-year Ravenclaw with long blonde hair, a butterbeer cork necklace, and radish earrings was laying on the floor, stiff as a board. Salazar's knees buckled underneath him, but Gordy caught him before he hit the floor. A bunch of terrified professors arrived on the scene and began sending the students to their houses. Albus stood there staring at the wall, then he bent over the girl and started to wave his wand over her. Gordy began trying to pull Salazar away from the scene, but he wouldn't budge. He just kept staring at the wall, the girl, and then the restroom door. "Move, you old fool," Gordy growled in his ear. "She's only petrified. Let's get you away from here before that idiot drags you into his office. You are in no condition to answer questions right now." Salazar still wouldn't budge.
Hey guys, what's going on? Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you guys want to watch more like it, please subscribe to my channel and become part of the video game fanfiction plot. And please leave a comment down below and hit that like button. If you guys have any suggestions on any stories you guys want me to read, don't hesitate. They're always welcome here in the Video Game Fanfic Plot. That also goes for video games. Until next time, goodbye!